what about safety? Like, what is the USDA? What is the EPA? All of these regulations, like, what are they doing around safety, and how is that related to this conversation around organics?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thankful we did the Additives podcast. I think it lays the groundwork for some of this stuff in terms of regulations. The U.S. food industry is highly regulated and monitored, and it's not perfect and it's still vulnerable. But I think there's more controls than people realize, which I hope is kind of what the Additives podcast did. And I hope, the supplement podcast did in terms of pharmaceutical drugs and what's not there for supplements. But basically the EPA or the FDA, depending on whether or not we're talking about pesticides, which would fall under EPA, or antibiotics and hormones, which would fall under the FDA, set the maximal amount that's allowed to be left on the food. And so these acceptable levels are generally referred to as tolerances. Other countries will also call these maximum residue limits, or MRLs. And I always like to remind people that, people often think these levels should be set at 0. Remember, we've got cyanide in almonds. You aren't afraid to eat almonds, right? So we're exposed to things all the time where the dose makes it safe. And so chemicals are going to be the same thing. Now, with pesticides, hormones, and antibiotics, the MRL is this maximum amount. The tolerance is the maximum amount that's allowed to be left. And when they set that for pesticides, for example, this is where the Additives podcast really comes into play. It's based on the toxicity of the pesticide. It's how much is applied and how often, how much is expected to be left on the food by the time it's marketed and harvested and sent to the store. And they also don't just look at that single product. They look at where else would people be exposed to this pesticide. Maybe that's through drinking water. Maybe that's through residential exposure. So they try to take a whole kind of comprehensive approach to where other exposure routes would be. And they apply that safety factor of 100, just like we talked about in the additives pesticide, where, there's a certain dose right before there's a problem from an animal toxicity standpoint, and they apply a safety factor of 100 to reduce that dose for what would be considered acceptable for humans. And again, if you want more detail on that, go back to the Additives podcast. So that's how they're going to go about looking at kind of what are these tolerances that are allowed to be left on foods. Now, hormones are going to be a little bit different because, of course, we naturally produce hormones. And so it's not that we would expect that there would be 0. That would be, a target number, for example. And so the FDA still is very conservative here. They look at, okay, we don't want the food to contribute more than 1% of what somebody would naturally produce. So it's still on this factor of 100, essentially. But they don't take like pregnant women as the example for like what estrogen can be in food, because that would be a very high level of estrogen relative to other human populations. Instead, they take the most conservative value, which would be, pre-puberty boys. And they say, okay, we don't want food to contribute, let's say, more estrogens than what pre-puberty boys would at a level of 1%. So again, they're set very conservative. And I think this is also just interesting to point out, because I don't know if we said it in the Additives podcast, but when they're looking at things like hormone use or for growth promotants, and when they're looking at things like pesticides, of course, and even antibiotic use, they not just consider the toxicology for humans, they also do consider what the environmental impact is. And so this is even true for non-organic crops. They're considering what the environmental impact will be from this regular application and use.
What about monitoring and enforcement? So that was kind of like the setting of expectations, or the setting of regulations. What about the other end of it, where what does that look like as best you can tell?
Yeah, I mean, they put out the rules. Who's following them, right?
Yeah.
We've got some pretty extensive sampling and monitoring programs. And to be honest, I'm not sure I totally figured out the maze by the time that we're recording this. I mean, I spent more time trying to figure out all the different monitoring programs. So if you're wondering where your tax dollars are going, I encourage you to look at some of these big agency organizations and look at some of the data that they're collecting. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's not just in pesticides and hormones. I mean, you can go to the CDC and look at antibiotic resistance. I mean, we're collecting a lot of data, Patrick. So related to this topic, for the USDA, they run the U.S. National Residue Program. That's for meat, poultry, and eggs. So that's where we're going to be monitoring antibiotics, hormones, and contaminants in those specific foods. That's the USDA doing that. The USDA is also running the Pesticide Data Program every year. That's, of course, specific to pesticides. In addition to that, we've got the FDA doing their own sampling on pesticide residues, and they focus a little bit more on domestic and imported goods, not just domestic as the USDA would do. And so we've got the USDA and the FDA sampling. They're reporting their results to either the FDA or the EPA for enforcement. And so there's some pretty comprehensive interagency setup here. And of course, this doesn't even include what your own state might be doing in addition to this, right? Now, I don't want to go through all the examples. Like I said, I mean, we're collecting a lot of data. I do want to highlight a couple kind of in these different areas that I know people care about. So pesticides, for example, the USDA has this pesticide data program. They started in 1991. They do sampling every year. They do look at both domestic and imported, but this one skews more heavily towards domestic products. They especially target foods for infants and children because they know that that's more vulnerable populations. And in the 2019 report, because 2020 report's coming out this fall, about 98.7% sampled were found to be below that tolerance level, or the MRL that we just described, which already has that safety factor built in it. And 42.5% of samples had no detectable residue. So like, you know, over 40% of samples didn't even have residue on it. And that's coming from over 9,700 samples from 10 different states. I will mention when they do sample these, they do a 15-second water rinse, which is kind of what you would probably do at home, but they're not applying more and they're not doing this more thorough washing. So that's pretty good. I mean, virtually 99% of samples have less than what is set as the MRL or the tolerance. If we look at something more like the antibiotics, and this again falls under the USDA, their residue program for that, they found that the percent violations have been under 0.4% for the last 4 years. And that's in the last report that I looked at, over 7,700 samples, which means they only had 21 violations out of all of those samples. Not that bad, right? And I think with antibiotics, something that's really interesting to bring up is antibiotics through food, where we are overusing antibiotics the most. The Smith-Sprangler paper that I already just touched on, they really point out that inappropriate use of antibiotics in humans is the major cause of our antibiotic resistance, right? And even the CDC reports that, 30% of antibiotic prescriptions are not necessary. So sometimes, again, I wonder if we're kind of like so worried about antibiotic use in animals when it's like, hey, we need to cut down on all of the different prescriptions that we have for antibiotics, right? And then finally, just a touch on hormones as the third area that people tend to care about a lot. And that's in this Palacios, I guess that's how you say it, paper from 2020, again, in the show notes. This was really cool. They took data from another paper that was looking at how much hormones exists in food. And then they were like, okay, cool, let's put together a sample diet that the USDA recommends and see how many hormones that we would get in that sample diet. And what they found was that the total hormones you'd be getting from your diet are less than 1% of what you would be naturally producing, just where the FDA wants to set it. So there is a lot of monitoring going on. And what the monitoring suggests is that we're doing pretty well in staying under these relatively conservative endpoints or metrics that we're trying to hit.
I think you touched on this at least a little bit today, and a little bit in the additives episode that we've done and that you've mentioned a few times. And it's this perception, perhaps, again, who knows how much of it just happens and how much of it is intentional, but that like these regulations that the government, that whatever, are like, they're just like, they don't know what they're talking about. And then there aren't any regulations and everything's dangerous. And like, can we just maybe just talk about that? Like, how did we get to a place where it feels like what we're being told is the opposite of what you just laid out, which is like incredibly stringent.
Yeah.
Why is there a perception that somehow the opposite is true?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, I was certainly there, so I like to think that I wasn't so, out in left field, but that you can get so down by following certain blogs and some mainstream postings that, gosh, it's just like, especially in the US, I'm assuming it's like this in other countries too, but I can speak to our perspective. I feel like you get to this point, it's like, wow, every other country is doing this better than we are, right? Like, we're just really bad at this. And gosh, like, we don't have any standards in place and we're just so terrible. And it's just not true. I mean, like I said, about 1% of the pesticide samples are exceeding this level, which already has a safety factor set at 100 safety fold from where we think there might be harm. What I want to point out about that as well is those samples that exceeded, over half of them were imported products. And, that's from the USDA report. The FDA report also found that most of its violations are on imported products. And my point here isn't to slight other countries at all. I think we all have our own our own issues and problems to continue to work on and get better. But it's just to give some sense that the systems and standards that we have in place are going relatively well. Are they perfect? No. Are other countries probably doing some things better than us? Yes. Do we probably do some things better than other places? Yeah. And to add on to this, I think hormones is a big one, because I know in Europe, for example, they don't allow hormones as growth promoters in their animals. And so I've gotten the question, well, why don't we do what Europe does? Well, there's two things there. First of all, I came across a paper that found that hormone use on the black market was more of an issue in Europe, which brings up an interesting point. I'm not saying that to fearmonger people who are living in Europe. It's just to bring up this point of, what does a full ban do? Do we end up creating another problem when we totally ban things that people want to use for their food production, right? And the other thing there is there are other countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, as well as some countries in Asia and South America and Africa that also have decided to allow certain amounts of growth promoters in their meat production. So I just want to point out that the U.S. is not, out in left field and everyone's in right field, that there are other people that are following this as well. And so, yeah, our system is not perfect. But I think there's a lot of messaging that makes it appear like we're just so terrible. And I just wanted to kind of set some guidelines or information out there that, yeah, we have some stuff in place, and it's not just sort of fly-by-night standards, and it's not, I don't think, careless or haphazard. The last thing I will say, and just sort of to echo that, is just to reiterate, they aren't perfect. You have to remember that the USDA, FDA, and EPA are huge. And think about their scopes. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible to think about their scopes. By default, they're going to be bureaucratic and inefficient at times, and slower moving at times, and even wrong at times. But their scope is, go monitor all of the food in the U.S. Go monitor all chemical use in the U.S. I mean, it's just so massive to even think about, right? And so it's just sort of, I love the process that we have. We've got independent scientists doing their thing, probably at a much faster rate, more at the cutting edge, all of that stuff. We've got our government scientists that are highly qualified doing stuff, evolving the policy to try to be in lockstep with the science. And it's a messy process, but I'm also not sure that regulating food production for an entire country or the world would be anything but that.
Yeah.